I was sitting in the lobby of a high-end fertility clinic in Seoul recently, watching a couple in their late 30s. They weren't holding hands, they were staring at a tablet, intensely debating hormone levels and frozen cycles, with the same clinical coldness you'd use for a business merger. There was a desperate precision to their conversation. To them, this was the most personal battle of their lives, a high-stakes gamble against their own biological clocks. But then I noticed something else. On the wall behind them was a government plaque, framed in gold, detailing a new state subsidy that covers nearly the entire cost of their procedure. It wasn't just healthcare, it was a strategic intervention. The usual narrative tells us that these technologies are about individual liberation or the triumph of science over nature. We're told that freezing eggs is the ultimate act of empowerment, a way to finally beat the patriarchy by delaying motherhood. But if you look at the ruthless speed with which East Asian states are pumping billions into these clinics, you start to realize that choice has very little to do with it. While the West looks toward mass immigration to fill its shrinking cities, essentially outsourcing its future, the East is making a much darker, more disciplined bet, engineering its own survival through the laboratory. What that couple in the waiting room saw as a private medical miracle, the state sees as civilizational adrenaline. It's a cold, calculated patch for a society that has become too expensive for its own people to inhabit. It leaves you wondering, is this technology actually freeing the individual, or is it just the last-ditch effort of a civilization trying to prevent its own extinction? Are we looking at the ultimate gift of modern medicine, or the final desperate move in a game of demographic statecraft?
And that observation, that scene in the clinic, that's really the core of what we're going to get into today. It's the mission of this deep dive.
Right. We're going beyond the usual story about, individual choice and these amazing medical breakthroughs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how these assisted reproductive technologies, or RT, have been, strategically woven into national policy across East Asia. It's a deliberate plan.
So we're zooming out from that couple and their tablet, that very personal, almost clinical negotiation, all the way up to the geopolitical level, to this idea that demographics are destiny.
Precisely. The mission for us today is to really unpack the forces at play here. The geopolitical, the economic, the cultural ones. You've got everything from China's massive centennial development plans to South Korea's really nuanced and aggressive use of state subsidies.
And all of this is turning these deeply private reproductive decisions into something else entirely.
Into acts of demographic statecraft. And what's just fascinating to me is the sheer scale of it and the speed. I mean, this isn't happening over centuries. This strategic use of RT right inside the national healthcare systems, it's a huge demonstration of East Asian state capacity.
A kind of civilizational resilience.
That's a great way to put it. Resilience against this global trend of demographic decline.
Yeah.
So we'll get into the deep history, the economics, and what this whole high-stakes game means for the people who are actually living it.
Okay, so let's start with the biggest player on the board. When we talk about population aging, it feels like it's a crisis everywhere. But in China, it seems like they've approached it less like a sudden crisis and more like a scheduled phase in a much, much longer journey.
That's the key difference, the depth of the planning. I mean, what's often missed is that China started actively planning for this intense aging period while it was still an upper middle income country.
They didn't wait until the pyramid was upside down.
Not at all. They were preempting it. The whole response is really anchored in what's called unified growth theory. It's this idea that you escape underdevelopment through technological change, but, and this is the important part, that requires a massive investment in human capital to keep the growth going once you're a high-income country. They knew that demographic window, that period of having lots of workers, was closing.
And they treated it like a fixed clock.
A non-negotiable deadline. And you can literally map their whole modernization plan onto these two huge, these centennial goalposts.
Okay, so what are they?
The first one was 2021, the anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And the goal for that date was all about achieving what they called moderate prosperity, or Shaokang.
Which means?
It meant getting everyone, every single citizen, to at least a lower middle per capita income. I mean, think about that. It was a poverty reduction effort on a scale we've never seen before.
And the second goalpost, the one that's driving all of this now.
That's the big one, the civilizational one, 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the PRC. And the plan is explicit. By then, China must be a fully modern state, a global leader in tech, in economics, in everything.
But to get there with a shrinking workforce, seems almost impossible. That means you need to sustain incredible growth, which is why their development strategy had to be so intense.
Radically intensified. That's how we get to what the research calls a rapid demographic transition complementary development strategy.
Which sounds incredibly complex. What does that mean in practice?
It's basically the classic Lewisian development model, but on steroids.
Yeah.
The original idea is that, you have all this surplus labor in farming, and it gradually gets absorbed by new factories in the city, and eventually wages go up for everyone.
A slow, organic process.
Right. But China couldn't afford slow. They had a fixed period demographic dividend, and they had to burn through it with incredible speed and discipline before it ran out. The timeline was everything.
So this all kicks off with the reform and opening era in 1978. And you're saying the first moves weren't even about building things?
No, not at all. The first moves were about building the rules, the legal and institutional plumbing to get foreign money and know how to come in. The big one was the Law on Chinese Foreign Equity Joint Ventures in 1979.
Why was that so important?
Because it was a signal. It was the state promising to protect foreign property in a way that was, frankly, unthinkable just a few years earlier. That's what told the global economy, okay, we're open for business.
And they backed that up with policies that were all about exporting.
Absolutely. They set up trade and exchange systems that just turbocharged their export base. They were fueling the engine that would use up that demographic dividend, and that led to their really famous strategy of geographically sequenced growth.
The SEZs, Special Economic Zones, that's what everyone knows, Shenzhen, Zhuhai.
Right. Those were the sparks in 1980. They were like magnets for all that foreign investment and export energy. You concentrate it all in a few places to see if it works.
And it worked so well, they scaled it up. Fast.
Incredibly fast. Just 8 years later, 1988, they launched the Coastal Development Strategy. So it's not just a few cities anymore, it's 12 entire coastal provinces getting the same treatment. The strategy was just surgical. Capture that demographic dividend while it's there, create millions of jobs.
But that must have created huge inequality between the coast and the inland areas.
It did. And by the 2000s, they had to pivot again. That's when you see the Western development strategy trying to bring that growth to the hinterland.
And by that point, the whole calculation had changed again.
It had to. Because by then, the coastal regions, Beijing, Shanghai, they were already basically functioning like high-income countries, even though China as a whole was still middle income. They had maxed out that window of cheap, plentiful labor.
So they'd used up the quantity, and now they had to pivot to quality. This is the post-dividend phase.
This is where it gets really focused. A shrinking workforce means that to hit those 2049 goals, every single worker needs to be radically more productive. You just can't rely on numbers anymore.
It's the core realization. To keep growing and to pay for a huge elderly population, you need quality over quantity.
Which demanded a massive government-funded pivot to education.
And we see the groundwork for that really early on with things like the compulsory education law in 1986.
Yes, that law set the base. 9 years of education for everybody, basic literacy. But the really huge moves came later, in the mid-90s, when the government was in a much stronger financial position.
You're talking about Project 211 and Project 985.
Exactly. These weren't just small funding changes. These were dedicated, massive investment streams designed to create clusters of genuinely world-class Chinese universities.
It was a strategic push to build a competitive edge in knowledge, in tech.
And the timing was just masterful. They expanded all this university capacity right as the first generations born under the one-child policy were coming of age. It was a direct trade-off. We're sacrificing population quantity for human capital quality.
So you've got education, but the final piece of this is actually re-engineering the entire economy to work in an aging society.
That's the goal now. Policies is aggressively shifting the country's comparative advantage towards things like aging-related industries and, maybe most importantly, labor-reducing technologies. Automation.
So the 2006 15-year plan for science and technology was really about this.
It explicitly targeted that transition, investing huge amounts in automation in sectors that don't need as many workers. They're trying to engineer their economy to basically leapfrog the usual problems of rapid aging.
Which brings us right back to the clinic in Seoul. Because this whole 70-year civilizational plan, this bet on survival, it all ends up with the realization that you still need a certain number of people. You need a population base.
You do. And if that base of human capital shrinks too much, even massive productivity gains can't sustain the vision. That's where the technology of reproduction itself becomes a tool of the state. It's the ultimate expression of technonatalism.
That directive in October 2024 from the central government seems to make it official. The call for a birth-friendly social atmosphere.
It made it undeniable because the directive wasn't just about talk. It specifically called for expanding medical insurance to cover assisted reproductive technology services.
So IVF, egg freezing, all of it. It's now part of the national strategy.
It's no longer just a personal medical choice. It's a high-level strategic tool for hitting national demographic targets. Reproduction has now been fully folded into the 70-year survival plan. It's a state-engineered biological hedge against decline.
Okay, so if China's strategy is all about this incredible scale and long-term foresight, South Korea's approach feels more, more intense, more focused.
I think that's a perfect way to describe it. Korea is a fascinating case study in consistency, even when the policy goal completely flips on its head.
What do you mean?
Well, whether the government was pushing to curb births back in the 70s with their family planning project, or now, post-2000, aggressively trying to boost them, the logic underneath is exactly the same.
I think it's always about the economy.
It's always about economic necessity. Reproduction is something to be managed for the good of the nation's bottom line. The governance style, that developmental governmentality, it just persists.
Meticulous planning, aggressive policy, and using reproduction for economic goals. So that big flip from control to calculation, that was made official with the Fellas Act in 2005.
The Framework Act on Low Birth Rate in an Aging Society.
Yeah.
And Fellas is so explicit. It frames a low birth rate not as a social problem, but as a direct threat to national competitiveness.
And when you frame it as a threat to competitiveness, that justifies almost any level of state intervention.
Any level of intervention, any amount of public money. But to make that intervention work, to get people on board, they had to do something really clever, a kind of social engineering.
You're talking about the shift in language, from infertility to subfertility.
Yes, the calculated rise of the term nanum, or subfertility, over the old term purim, which meant infertility. This was a brilliant political victory led by the Korean Federation of Subfertile Families, the KFSF.
They understood that the words you use determine everything.
Absolutely. The old term, purim, was socially devastating. It had this huge traditional stigma attached to it. I mean, it was associated with concepts like stone women. It implied a permanent failure, a defect.
But the new word, nanum.
Nanum changes the whole story. It means, you're having difficulty, but you are still fertile enough to conceive with medical help. It reframes the whole condition as a hopeful status.
And their campaign was literally visual.
It was masterful. They showed the old term with a gray, broken heart, inability, failure, and the new term with a pink whole heart, potential, hope. They essentially turned RT, this complex medical process, into a happy object.
Wait, so the government, or at least this influential group, literally used a PR campaign with broken hearts and pink hearts to change the law. That feels less like governing and more like psychological mobilization.
That's a great way to put it. And it worked. The bill to officially replace the terminology passed in 2011. Nanum became the official destigmatized term, and this was all tied to their big policy ask.
Because just talking about individual suffering wasn't working.
No. The KFSF found that when they just talked about the pain of infertile women, the government kept rejecting their pleas for help. But when they reframed their cause, when they started positioning themselves as providing the solution to the national low birth rate crisis,
that's when the state started listening.
And that's the moment the state fully embraced RT support as this crucial tool of what we can call productive welfarism.
Okay, break that down. Productive welfarism.
It's a type of welfare that isn't just about support. It's about getting a measurable economic return on your investment. In this case, you target your resources, the subsidies, at married heterosexual women who already have a strong desire to have children. You identify them as qualified mothers.
And the metric for success is simple. Did they produce a newborn?
Exactly. It's mobilizing a deep-seated personal desire for the state's collective economic goal. It's incredibly efficient.
And you can see this commitment just ramping up over time in the national health insurance expansion.
You can trace it perfectly. It started small in 2006 with subsidies for low-income households. Then, by October 2017, the NHI was covering RT for all subscribers.
But the most recent move is the one that's really shocking.
It shows an almost desperate level of commitment. In February 2024, they expanded NHI coverage to include up to 20 cycles of IVF.
20 cycles, that is just staggering. I mean, most insurance plans in the West, if they cover it at all, they might balk at 5 or 6. What does a policy like that even communicate to a person going through this?
The financial scale alone tells you that the state sees every potential birth as an incredibly valuable national resource, one that justifies almost any cost. But to the individual, it sends this powerful institutionalized message of persistence.
The state is telling you not to give up.
It's encouraging you to internalize the government's own mode of waiting out the crisis. You, the individual, are now expected to persist through multiple, often heartbreaking rounds of failure, all because the institution has promised to be there to pay for the next attempt.
Is that even financially sustainable? 20 cycles could mean a decade or more of intensive treatment for one couple. It feels like a short-term adrenaline shot.
But they see it as a long-term strategic investment. It's a bet on the marginal success rate of just trying again and again and again. For the state, the cost of creating one new citizen through RT is, in their calculation, cheaper than the long-term economic damage of a shrinking population.
And it reinforces this whole culture of hope.
Exactly. The KFSF and the state work together. They celebrate these heroic stories of couples who finally succeed after the 10th or 15th attempt. It normalizes enduring this crisis as a kind of civic duty.
And this all connects back to that history of state planning. People were already trained, in a sense, to link their family choices to the national economic plan.
That's the legacy. The population, maybe unconsciously, accepts that their reproductive choices are tied to the country's future. The message used to be, fewer children means prosperity. Now is just flipped 180 degrees.
More children, by any means necessary, means prosperity.
The underlying logic is identical. It's the instrumentalization of reproduction for economic stability. So that massive expansion of coverage, it's not just healthcare, it's building the infrastructure for persistent biological labor. But to really get why people are willing to go through all of this, to subject themselves to this intense process, you have to look at their lives outside the fertility clinic. You have to look at the economy.
Right. Especially the economic restructuring that happened after the 1997 Asian financial crisis. It created this huge insecurity.
Immense job insecurity and polarization. It basically split the workforce in two. You have this privileged group of regular, well-paid workers, usually in the big conglomerates, the cable, or in the public sector.
And then you have everyone else, the huge, precarious group of non-regular workers.
And that economic divide, that instability, is what directly causes what we can call structural infertility.
So this isn't a biological problem at its root, it's an economic and social one.
Exactly. Structural infertility is the idea that you can't conceive, not because of your body, but because of your life circumstances. Women are forced to delay having children until they can get that career stability, that financial security.
Which often pushes them right up against their biological clock.
Right to the edge. The cost and pressure of raising a child in that environment is just too high to risk until you feel you've achieved that qualified status.
Let's talk about that pressure for a second. Why is the cost of child rearing so high? What does that really look like?
It's driven by this culture of what's called intensive mothering. It's basically a societal education arms race. From the moment a child is born, parents are expected to make these huge competitive investments to make sure their child succeeds as, well, competitive human capital.
So we're talking expensive private tutoring, after-school academies, getting into the right schools.
All of it. It requires enormous financial resources and a huge time commitment from parents. So if you don't have job security, if you can't plan for the next 20 years of that kind of investment, delaying is the only rational choice, even if it means you might need medical help later.
And the perfect example of this whole dynamic is the group that doesn't have this problem. Public school teachers.
They are the exception that proves the rule. This group has one of the highest fertility rates in South Korea, and it's because they are insulated from all that precarity.
They have high guaranteed job security.
And, crucially, they have amazing benefits that are specifically designed to support them having children. For example, they can get up to 2 years of paid sick leave, specifically for subfertility treatment. They get 70% of their salary for that first year.
That's incredible. That completely de-risks the whole process.
It acts as this massive push factor towards having kids. In those workplaces, having 2 children isn't an exception, it's the norm. And that social norm then encourages others who might be struggling to seek treatment earlier. It creates this safe pathway to balance a career and the demands of intensive mothering.
Okay, so contrast that protected group with, well, pretty much everyone else in the private sector, the entrepreneurial self, as you call it.
For them, pregnancy can't be left to chance. It becomes another project to be managed, a timed project. It needs strategic planning, resource allocation, and a focus on efficiency.
And RRTs are just the tools for that project.
They're the ultimate efficiency tool. And you see the pressure even before they get to the clinic. The sources talk about the burden of timed intercourse.
Which is basically the logistical nightmare of trying to conceive naturally when you have two high-pressure careers.
It's the chaos of the neoliberal work week, trying to coordinate two conflicting schedules. Who's in town? Who's not exhausted? Who's healthy? It's a project management problem. Procreative sex gets stripped of all intimacy and just becomes this mechanical task you have to complete, disciplined by fertility apps and temperature trackers.
The story about Sharon is so telling here. A woman in her early 30s who just decides to go straight to IVF.
She's the perfect embodiment of this mindset. She didn't even know if she was biologically infertile. Her problem was a time inefficiency problem. Waiting around to see if natural conception would happen was, in her words, a waste of time that could interfere with her career.
So for her, the physical and financial cost of 11 ARCI treatments in 2 years was a better deal than losing control over her schedule.
It was a lesser threat. Her biggest fear was a loss of control. And that's where the technology itself provides the ultimate time management solution. This is what the sources call RT's choreography.
Okay, that's a great term. What does it mean?
It's the system's genius solution to this structural problem. The technology manipulates time by separating the biological materials, the eggs and sperm, from the chaotic schedules of the actual human bodies.
So you can freeze the eggs and sperm.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The woman's career is on one timeline, and the reproductive materials, the gametes, are sitting frozen in inventory. They're on a separate timeline. And they just wait there until the perfect, most efficient, highly controlled moment for the transfer can be scheduled.
So the lab synchronizes the materials, not the people. It gets around the need for the couple to be in the same place at the same time, feeling healthy and ready.
Precisely. It's a labor-saving device for making babies. It lets the entrepreneurial self keep their career momentum. You externalize the biological work into a predictable, manageable system.
And the state subsidizes this whole process of control. It allows people who were forced to delay to finally become qualified parents later in life.
When they've achieved not just the money, but that mental maturity and stable environment they feel they need for intensive mothering, it's a perfect closed loop. The economic system creates the delay, and the state-subsidized technological system provides the fix. But it's so important to remember that none of this is happening in a vacuum. These state policies, these economic pressures, they're all interacting with these really deep established cultural norms.
Right. Despite this relentless push of neoliberalism and individualism, there's still this cultural buffer of familialism in East Asia.
A hugely important buffer. It speaks to the deep structural power of Confucian values in these societies. The basic unit isn't the autonomous individual making choices for themselves. The basic unit is the family. And the goal is communal harmony.
And there's actual research that shows how this works, right? The idea of filial piety.
Yes, and it's fascinating. There are studies on Chinese older adults that show the real protective effect of this. The researchers found that if you just reminded older participants of the principle of filial piety, the younger generation's duty to respect their elders, it could completely eliminate the negative cognitive effects of age-based stereotype threat.
Wow. So just reminding them of the cultural expectation of respect actually protected their brains from the harm of ageism.
That's how powerful it is. It suggests this incredible resilience against the kind of social atomization, the loneliness, the demographic entropy you see in more hyper-individualistic Western societies. The duty of care is structural. It's owed by the group to the elder.
But even with that strong family base, this incredibly intense, disciplined pursuit of a baby through RT has to have a huge emotional toll on the people going through it.
A profound emotional toll. And it's something the policy discussion often misses. The procedure itself, it forces women and couples into these really complex, intense attachments with what you could call liminal lives.
You mean the reproductive materials themselves, the eggs, the embryos.
Exactly. And the clinics, in an effort to keep patients hopeful and engaged, they actively encourage you to humanize these things. They give you real-time updates. They show you these incredible images of your cells dividing on a screen. They give you detailed scientific reports.
So patients start giving them names, praying for them. You're bonding with these quasi-lives before you even know if they'll result in a pregnancy.
The emotional stakes get incredibly high right from the very beginning. But the whole policy narrative is just about success, persistence, getting that live birth for the nation. And that focus masks the hidden cost.
The unmasked risk.
The risk of failure, both emotional and physical. I mean, beyond the grief, There's a real rise in high-risk pregnancies and premature births that are associated with RT.
Yeah.
There was one woman, Sohee, who had twins through IVF, and she was so frustrated because the doctors were so focused on her success that they never really warned her about the specific risks of a twin pregnancy.
Which resulted in a preterm birth and a terrible hospital stay.
Right. But the most heartbreaking part of this hidden cost is when couples experience loss after a successful treatment. This is what led to this devastating idea of the no little death revelation.
Tell me about that.
There was a couple who, after going through ART, finally conceived and gave birth. But their newborn tragically died just 3 days later. And the husband, looking back, he realized the whole system, the doctors, the policy, the whole narrative was so clinically focused on the delivery, on the success, that it had completely ignored the profound grief that comes with a little death.
And they always called the baby their first child, even though he only lived for 72 hours.
Always. Which just underscores this huge psychological debt that the policy of persistence creates. If you go through 10, 15, 20 IVF cycles, you are repeatedly going through this cycle of bonding with and then parting from these cherished quasi-lives.
And that continuous trauma is just written off as a medical failure.
It's dismissed as just matter, not a life. But when that couple says there is no little death, what they mean is that for the person experiencing it, every single one of those losses, whether it's a perfect-looking embryo that fails to implant or an infant who lives for 3 days, is mourned as a full, profound loss.
And the system that tells you to just keep trying, up to 20 times, is basically demanding that you accumulate success and trauma in equal measure.
It completely changes your relationship with life, with death, with what it even means to create a family. It's a really sobering counterpoint to the shiny high-tech story of technonatalism. The state gets to count its successes in live births, but the individual has to live through this constant state of emotional limbo and repeated loss to produce that success.
We started this with that image of a couple in a clinic treating their fertility like a business merger. And we've kind of traced that hyper-disciplined personal project all the way back to the biggest civilizational ambitions of the state.
It's all connected. The interaction of that macro policy ambition from China's 100-year plans to Korea's productive welfarism and the relentless microeconomic pressure on the individual is completely remade what it means to have a child.
And the strategic integration of RT coverage, especially something as extreme as 20 cycles in South Korea, it institutionalizes this idea. The pursuit of birth becomes a national necessity.
It's no longer a private affair. This disciplined strategy, it really has very little to do with individual empowerment in the end. It's a strategic, high-tech intervention to ensure civilizational survival.
Yeah.
The bet that these societies are making is crystal clear. They're building a future where their descendants will owe their very existence not just to love or to chance, but to the cold, calculated arithmetic of the state.